Hello and welcome to American Friction. I'm Jacob Jarvis. So in a slight change to our schedule, we are going to do an episode unpacking what the hell happened in the Oval Office between Trump, Vance and Zelenskyy, how America is reacting and what is going to happen next. So joining me today is, of course, my good friend Nikki McCann Ramirez. Hi, Nikki.
Good morning, Jarv.
Plus, we're joined by Matt Duss, Executive Director of the Center for International Policy and co-host of the Undiplomatic podcast. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Very glad to be here. Thanks.
Nikki, so I was actually out when the Oval Office meeting was happening, and my phone just suddenly lit up with people texting me saying variations of what the hell is going on, and this is totally gross. The video I watched after it just left me feeling really sort of disconcerted, quite uncomfortable beyond it. What was your initial gut reaction to watching it?
I mean, my gut reaction was, this is really, really bad. I think we've been watching tensions between Trump, the Ukrainians build up over the last couple of weeks, especially after the meetings Trump's people had with Russians in, I believe, Saudi Arabia that took place last week. All the comments calling Zelenskyy a dictator, casting doubts on the legitimacy of his presidency. We've been seeing that tension build and build and build and build. And typically when we go into these meetings, you're expecting sort of a ceremonial, there's a handshake, there's a little meeting, there's a press conference, we sign some documents, everyone's happy, everyone goes home to their respective countries, and we keep on talking. I don't think anyone had ever seen a blow up of that nature in the Oval Office televised. That's the type of meeting that journalists will hear about, from a second or third source who tells them like, hey, by the way, I heard the other day in XYZ meeting, so-and-so called this guy an idiot, and you'll write it up as like, sources are telling me. You don't typically get, the full frontal view of how the diplomatic sausage is made. So that, I think, was also really jarring for people to see, because it's not just the fact that this is happening between Trump and Zelenskyy. It's the fact that there wasn't even any effort to hide it, to wait until they were in a private room, away from cameras, away from microphones. To me, it did really feel like an ambush, but I can't speak to the mentality of these people going into that meeting.
Yeah, it kind of felt like the sort of thing you'd expect from, I don't know, a Bob Woodward book in 4 years or something, not something that would come out immediately at the time. So seeing that happening, yeah, it felt really strange. I mean, Matt, before we get into all the fallout of the meeting, can we just touch back a little bit on some of the context about why it was even taking place? Because, as Nikki said, should this have all been a lot more straightforward, or did it feel initially before it happened like it should just be talking about a mineral deal and kind of away we go?
Yeah, listen, Trump has made no secret, even before he was elected, that he was going to shift policy toward Russia and the war in Ukraine. He was very critical of the way that the Biden administration had handled it. He said repeatedly, if I had been president, this war would not have happened. Vladimir Putin would never have dared do such a thing while Donald Trump was president. And yeah, just over the past few weeks, you had, first of all, Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which really signaled a shift in U.S. policy away from let's call it the traditional alliance with Europe. But also you had a meeting between Vance and Rubio with Zelenskyy or maybe it was Waltz and Rubio, but with President Zelenskyy to discuss this minerals deal, which was, from Trump's perspective, a way to get the U.S. invested in profits coming from Ukraine's national resources, which in his view would offer some form of guarantee. If not an actual, security guarantee of the kind that then Zelenskyy wants. There was some disagreement about how that meeting went in Munich. Zelenskyy publicly said, I can't sign this deal under these terms. Rubio was very angry about that. He seemed to think that Zelenskyy was more receptive. So you had a couple weeks of tension after that. You had Trump's comments calling Zelenskyy a dictator, questioning, as Nikki said, the legitimacy of his presidency. But then the day before the meeting, on Thursday, you had this really interesting exchange during the press conference with Prime Minister Starmer, where Trump was asked, do you still believe that Zelenskyy is a dictator? And he's like, did I say that? I can't believe I said such a thing. So again, sort of classic Trump, just kind of discarding what he said, mere days before. But it did seem to signal that he was preparing to have a bit more of a cordial meeting with Zelensky than I think many expected. I was surprised by that. But then, of course, I was also in a meeting when that Oval Office, meeting was taking place, and my phone also blew up. I'm trying to pay attention to what we're all talking to, but you can kind of see everyone sort of checking their phones, like, oh my God, what is happening?
Was there a specific flashpoint that seemed to derail it, or in the broader context, sort of JD Vance just seemed to act as though he felt sort of disrespected and that was it. But now with a bit of space from it and looking at it more broadly, can we pinpoint what maybe really truly took it off course?
Well, yeah, just watching it, for about 30 minutes, it was fine. There was this conversation, and Trump was being Trump, and Vance was kind of sitting there, and Marco Rubio was sitting next to him looking miserable as always. And Zelensky, it was cordial. If it was a little tense, obviously, of course, given what Zelensky is dealing with, what he has endured, and now just understanding I need to make it through this. I need to kind of not get into a fight. But then as Zelensky was explaining from his perspective, the idea, his response to the idea that we need to sign a peace deal with Putin, saying quite reasonably, we have had peace deals with Putin in the past. He has abrogated them and taken more of my country. And there was a point at which, Vance then interjected to kind of challenge Zelensky, and Zelensky responded to that, and it kind of went downhill from there. I think as soon as Vance, introduced the idea that Zelensky was being disrespectful, that's something that's always going to trigger Donald Trump, and perhaps was designed to trigger Donald Trump. A lot of people have been out there saying, "Oh, this was planned." I don't know if that's the case, but it does seem that Vance was trying to be provocative, and unfortunately, he succeeded.
Nikki, just on a sideline to that, on the sort of the pre-planned side of it, I don't want to get into sort of the conspiracy theory realm there, but JD Vance seemed like he was such a big deal in the campaign. And then since then, clearly, Elon Musk has been the big deal, and JD Vance has kind of felt like a traditional vice president, which is sort of
not existing.
Basically not existing, yeah. Does this feel a little bit like, he saw this as his moment to go, well, fuck it, I'm gonna cause some trouble of my own and throw myself about there and insert myself in a way. There is a bit of a void when it comes to who runs Trump's foreign policy. It used to be Jared Kushner. Now it's kind of, who knows who that's going to be. So I don't know. Is he trying to sort of do that a little bit? Does he just want some attention?
Theoretically, it's Marco Rubio, who is also an empty shell of a human being.
Yeah.
But I think the way I've been looking at it in the past couple days is, I agree. I don't necessarily think it was pre-planned. What I think was very well established was the attitude. We've heard the way Republicans talk about Ukraine, from Congress all the way up to Trump and Vance. Like Matt said, it's no secret that not only were they going to push American foreign policy toward Russia, the Republican Party for years now, since almost a couple months after this war started, has viewed the Ukrainians with a certain level of disdain. So I think you have this kind of clash between the campaign promise Trump made that he could end the war in 24 hours, that he would negotiate an end to this war, and the reality that Republicans don't want to make concessions to the Ukrainians. Republicans will view making concessions to the Ukrainians as the abandonment of the promises and the rhetoric and the posturing they've had for over 2 years now. So I think coming into this meeting, Vance in particular, I feel like, had this attitude, the showboating attitude, that now was his opportunity to confront Zelensky face to face and kind of own him. In a way, not necessarily thinking about the grievous foreign policy implications that could stem from that, the downwind consequences. I don't think I've seen a major foreign policy expert argue that this meeting was good for Trump and Vance. I've seen Republican constituents, influencers on social media. I've seen Fox News act like, this was a great show of force that put Zelensky in his place and showed the world what America is about now. In the grand scheme of things, is that going to help us end a war and put a check on, Russian power, Russian influence in Europe? Probably not. But it is what it is now. Like, the shit cake is here.
Matt, I mean, on that, it's the sort of coming back to bite Trump side of things. There feels to be constantly this notion that being chaotic is kind of useful to him in an international realm. So, generalist commentators seem to make that quite often. But surely from here, if he is willing to let people like JD Vance or people like JD Vance are able just to derail things for him, that isn't a useful look more broadly for him and isn't useful for American diplomacy, surely.
Well, I don't know if JD Vance actually derailed it, and I don't want to go too far with the metaphor that, Nikki introduced earlier about the full frontal view of sausage. But this was, as in most things with Trump, a dominance display. This is what Donald Trump sells. I am dominant, whether in personal relationships, whether in business relationships, and now in global, foreign policy, security relationships. There's that aspect that I think is very important. But in terms of where the policy is going, first, let's understand, the kind of constituencies on foreign policy. One, you have the kind of MAGA cult constituency that knows very little, cares very little about Ukraine as Ukraine, but it's simply an element of culture war, right? It's good enough for them that Joe Biden and the Democrats supported Ukraine, and so therefore they oppose it. Biden and Democrats and others, love Zelenskyy, so therefore they hate him. They come up with all kinds of reasons why he's illegitimate, etc. Then you've got, I think, of more serious foreign policy thinkers who see Ukraine in this war as a drain and a distraction from the real challenge of China. And then you've got kind of more, I guess, traditional kind of neoconservative or just hawkish Republicans. But they've been generally kind of just housebroken. I mean, Rubio is the most perfect example of this. I mean, no pet in history has ever been more effectively housebroken than Marco Rubio. And the same is true of someone like Lindsey Graham, who just, a few weeks ago was in Munich on stage, literally praising Zelenskyy up and down, and then who immediately came out after the White House press conference to criticize Zelenskyy. So you can you never know where Zelenskyy is going to land, but he will always be tightly attached to Trump's leg. So it's really only the kind of the first two constituencies I mentioned that really tend to matter here the most. But in terms of the policy, listen, Trump, he says he wants to make peace. Peace would be great, as I've said before. The details of this will matter. A peace that simply gives Russia a pause before coming back for more of Ukraine is not really a peace. But I think from his perspective, what came out of this that I think he may see as good is that this put the onus now on Zelenskyy. He's saying, come back to me when you want peace. I mean, the key decision maker on whether there is peace in Ukraine is Vladimir Putin. That is where the onus should be. He is the one who launched this war. He is the one most responsible for it continuing. He is the one who could end this war today if he chose to do so. But Trump is choosing to approach this as if, well, both sides are kind of the problem here. And I think coming out of that meeting, he understands that, right-wing media and Republicans in the party are going to side with him no matter what. So, from his perspective, I see this as putting more pressure on Zelenskyy. But the ultimate question is, okay, for what? Does that get us to an actual, sustainable, durable, let alone just peace agreement for Ukraine? I'm unclear that it does. I mean, if it gets the European countries to step up a bit more, obviously we have this summit happening. We'll see what comes out of that. The UK and France have announced that they're going to work with Ukraine to make a peace proposal. We look closely at the details of that. But again, I see, Trump has wanted to kind of improve relations with Russia. There's no question about that. And I think he feels that by, kind of putting the spotlight on Zelenskyy here as Zelenskyy being the problem, that's a successful move.
For just on that quickly, with Trump and this sort of his desire for peace and the sort of want to end wars and want to end American involvement in wars. Mm-hmm. Does he actually not want the wars to end to an extent because he wants to be able to keep saying that? And then if the wars do end, then he has to actually engage in a slightly more complex and slightly more holistic foreign policy, which he maybe doesn't have the mindset or determination to do. It's quite handy for him to be able to say, I want to stop wars. Like that's sounds good to say.
I mean, I think there's part of him because, let's understand, I think the kind of key, driver at the root of all of Trump's policy pronouncements, domestic or foreign, is the idea that we're getting ripped off. We're spending all this money. Allies are ripping us off, whether it's in domestic policy, whether it's in foreign policy. That's part of his criticism of NATO. Oh, we're spending all this money and protecting these countries, and they get all these benefits, and we're the suckers. So I think he sees it in kind of those terms. It's like, what have we gotten by spending, these trillions of dollars on these wars over the past 20 years in the Middle East? And, I don't know that there's a clear strategy, as you laid out. But I do think what's important to note about this is that a lot of Americans agree with that. Repeatedly, a majority of Americans agree with that general sentiment. We don't want to be involved in all these wars. We want stability. Yes, we want a strong country. But it's very strange. I mean, this past election, you had essentially Donald Trump, especially in the last few weeks of the campaign, leaning in very much on this pro-peace message, and Democrats essentially as the pro-war party. And then, I wrote a piece in The Guardian a few weeks ago, kind of a longish piece looking at this. And one of the data points I noted was since the end of the Cold War, since the 1992 election, with the one exception of 2004, is that the more pro-peace, less interventionist, less militarist candidate has won every single election. That should really tell us something. Now, that's not to say that foreign policy determines elections. It almost always does not. But I do think that's just an important data point. It's a candidate who's offering, less war, less chaos. Now, obviously, the idea that Donald Trump would be offering less chaos is kind of a funny thing to say, but that is what he ran on. And I think that really got traction, as it often does.
Touching back a little bit on Europe, the reaction from Europe's leadership overall seems overwhelmingly supportive of Ukraine. How is this meeting changing the dynamics of the continent? I think one of the major pending questions is if it's even possible for Europe to manage the threat posed by Russia, its general overall security, and potentially negotiate an end to this war without the full support of the United States. Like, at this point, does Europe start considering the U.S. an unreliable ally and sort of split off to make moves on its own?
Yeah. I mean, if Europe has not already begun to consider the United States an unreliable ally after the first Trump administration, I really don't know what to say. I do think that there was a sense of false relief when Biden was elected, supported, unfortunately, by Biden himself, who was all out there like, America's back, everybody relax, the adults are back in charge. But it turns out, because again, even though, Americans elected Biden, there's a lot of reasons why they chose Biden over Trump. The changes that Trump was proposing in American policy, foreign and domestic policy, are rooted in a real constituency, not just among Republicans. I mean, there are a lot of Americans who really feel that the so-called Washington consensus in global economics and foreign policy and all these kind of global security commitments are not delivering for them. So they did not want kind of this nostalgic kind of Cold War, post-Cold War, America leading the global international liberal order, whatever approach that Biden brought them. They really did want to change. Now, Europe, I would hope, finally is getting the message. It does seem from the statements, from the kind of the consultations and the meetings that are going on, they do understand that at long last, they need to get quite serious very quickly about their own security. I would love to see that. This is kind of the foreign policy waiting for Godot. Okay, when is, European strategic autonomy going to happen? Is it now? But just in terms of, material reality, in the short to medium term, Europe is just not going to be able to fill the gap if the United States stops arming and supplying Ukraine, period. They could ramp up very quickly should they choose to, manufacturing some of this ammunition, some of this material. But if the United States were to cut off aid immediately, I think we'd see slow and then fast, Russian advance. So again, I think we should, look closely at the details of this peace proposal that the UK, France, and Ukraine are apparently working on. But I do think we should also think about this minerals deal that has been proposed, because even though it's just so blatantly a form of sort of extractive pressure from the United States.
Yeah. It's a cover charge.
It's a cover charge, exactly. But again, going back to Donald Trump's, driving, theory of politics, like we shouldn't be getting ripped off. How are we getting paid? And in some ways, it's a more honest approach to U.S., foreign policy, which is if you want to be part of the protection racket, you got to kick upstairs. So what are you paying us? But again, I don't dismiss the idea that by having U.S. personnel, and Trump and his folks have put this out there, by having U.S. companies, which will almost certainly be connected to Trump companies in some way, you better believe that the Trump world is going to profit from this minerals deal. But by having those American companies and American workers in Ukraine, this would act as a sort of security guarantee, a kind of tripwire to ensure against Russia restarting the war. But also to believe that, you would need to believe that the Trump administration or a future administration would respond to such an attack with force. And I'm not sure that Ukraine or anyone can really believe that.
Yeah.
Nikki, the reaction over here in Britain, it's been quite strange to see for once, like the partisan media all seem to be on a similar page that what Trump has done here was wrong. And the way he behaved was pretty apparent. The Daily Mail, which is a newspaper I fundamentally disagree with on near enough everything ever, had pretty much the strongest front page condemning Donald Trump of the lot of them. But they also generally tend to be on the right here in the UK, somewhat sympathetic to Trump. So touching to what Matt said there, that on foreign policy, generally, a lot of what Trump is saying, a lot of Americans agree with. How are Americans reacting to this, and how are the media reacting to it? Is it somewhat confused?
I think there's still a pretty partisan split. Like, the litmus test I always use is my dad, who's a lifelong Republican, dislikes Trump with a passion. He's very much like your old guard, like socially liberal, fiscally conservative type of Republican kind of guy. Infamously, as I once said on this podcast, the kind of guy who really liked Bush. He was appalled. My father was absolutely appalled by the spectacle that took place in the Oval Office. He was like, this is idiotic. We look stupid. We look incompetent. Like, the consensus I'm getting from your more, like, independent-y, centrist, quote-unquote, for lack of a better word, voters, constituents, is this was embarrassing. There was no need for that to happen. We need to get this war, like, wrapped up and finished. Like, they want the war to end. They think this was a major setback. The Trumpist faction of Republicanism is, oorah, America first. Like, yeah, you showed that little man who refuses to wear a suit what we're all about. That's a whole other topic, the suit situation that I don't even want to get into on this show. And of course, I think, your liberals, your Democrats, people farther to the left are, as expected, more critical of the Trump administration. That split seems to mirror within the media. I mean, you saw Fox News was actually, I'll take that back a little. Fox News, primetime, extremely on Trump's side. Your 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. shows, which are sort of the shows Fox News touts to its investor meetings as its like hard news people who make them a respectable news outlet and not just an entertainment channel. They were having a really hard time getting behind the White House line that Zelenskyy had been disrespectful, that Trump and Vance's reaction was completely merited and justified. They were very critical of how things went down. But of course, those people, they're not the bulk of Fox's viewership. So I think it does speak to that split I was talking about earlier about how you have your sort of like more centrist Republicans who are annoyed by this, and that represents daytime Fox. And then you have your Trump faction who is yelling at the top of their lungs that this is the greatest thing to ever happen to American diplomacy.
Matt, with where we kind of go from here, I suppose, like, do you think there's a route backwards? Like, can we take those step backwards to then be able to move forwards, return to that deal? Do you think that's a viable situation? Or does it feel like, the way Trump is going, it's kind of just all forwards into the unknown at the moment?
I think Trump, genuinely wants to end this war. He wants to be able to say he ended the war. And I do think that one thing that Ukraine has on its side is that Trump does not want Kyiv to be his Kabul. He does not want to, broker a peace deal, get out there and say, I have brokered the greatest peace deal in the history of peace deals. And then a year, 2 years, later, have it all fall apart. If it's going to fall apart, it should happen under someone else. And he could say, never would have happened if I was there. So, I think, again, looking at the details of any deal is important. I think if Europe is seen as stepping up in a much more serious way, investing, spending, picking up the tab in a much more serious and public way, that's going to please him. And in terms of the relationship with Zelenskyy, again, it's horrible to say this given, I've visited Ukraine. I was there 2 years ago, and we've all seen what Ukraine is dealing with. We've seen, I'll just say to know, Zelenskyy, who no one had any great expectations for, the courage he has shown, what he has endured, the leader has turned out to be is extraordinary. So the idea that, in order to kind of improve the relationship with Donald Trump and the United States, he's going to need to find a way to kiss the ring in some way that is, humiliating, with the understanding that he has his own politics too. I mean, he is, standing up for his people in the midst of a devastating war. But in some way, there's going to be a need to kind of improve that relationship to get back to the deal. Because again, I think, Trump is genuinely interested in this because it's a way for him to say, look, I'm getting us paid back for all the money that we've given them. But I do think a key thing here is, for Europe to show that they are getting engaged in a much more serious way. Yes, Donald Trump, we have heard you. You are making so much sense. It's really, we need to take more responsibility for security in our neighborhood.
Just finally, on a tangent on that, Matt, I mean, there's been some people have questioned Keir Starmer and maybe how sort of overly convivial he seemed to Donald Trump in a way that maybe some people on the left might not be super comfortable with in this country. Just, a lot of our listeners are based in Britain. Your take on how Starmer is kind of handling that? Do you think he's kind of done the job that he needs to do?
Well, I mean, I'll say, not being the hugest fan in general, I think, as Nikki said, in the public meetings, that's how you handle it with Trump. And that's how you tend to handle it in general. Okay, you're there, you're doing a photo op, you're sitting in the Oval Office, you're in the chairs, you got the flags. And especially with Trump, you have to deal with this person in this way. You understand who you are dealing with. I'm sorry to say, as an American, this is our president right now. And if leaders want to get the best they can for their countries, you need, unfortunately, to deal with them in a certain way. Now, in the meetings behind closed doors, and there was going to be a meeting, there was supposed to be a meeting after the Zelenskyy public meeting where they were going to hammer out the final details and sign the minerals deal. That meeting was canceled. Zelenskyy was asked to leave the White House. Those, I think, are the meetings where some of this stuff can get more tense and you speak much more frankly. And then, of course, later on, you go to Bob Woodward's house and eat soup and tell him what happened. Or you leak to Barack Ravid, a few hours later, as tends to happen now, too. But yeah, so again, I understand. I mean, it's not just Starmer. It's pretty much, I mean, you look a few weeks ago, you had King Abdullah from Jordan, who, sitting there praising Trump. You won't see a more uncomfortable kind of person than the leader who's kind of squirming in their seat, trying to just keep their composure as Trump's all over the place. But again, that's what we're dealing with right now in the White House.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, very glad to. Thanks for inviting me.
Nikki, thank you for joining us as ever as well.
Always a pleasure, Jarv.
And thank you to all of you for listening to American Friction. Remember, if you want bonus content and ad-free episodes, you can support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/American Friction to find out how. And if you can't support us financially, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate and review us wherever you're listening. Thank you for joining us for American Friction.